In this video, we're going to learn more about changing the object properties using Sketch-A-Stitch. And so, generally speaking, every type of brush has the ability to be modified with the properties box. And so let's go ahead and take a look. For example, if we choose tapered ends and then draw a line and zoom in over top of our line. So first of all, to be able to interact with the properties of any shape, you will need to use the select tool to select it. And you can select a shape by clicking on it, and it will become highlighted with a box. That's what we call the transformation box. And once the box has been sort of displayed, you'll know it is selected. And now you can look at your properties box on the side where there are further abilities to enhance this. And so you know that I showed you when I'm drawing it. So for example, if I click back on the sketchbook tool and I click on the brush tool, that I can also change the width right here from a narrow to a more wider and a more wider one. And so let's draw one that's 3 right beside the one that we made before, which was narrower. I think it was 1. And so now we have 2 shapes, and I can choose which one I select by clicking on each one of them, and I can also select them both by clicking and dragging. And I want to point out the difference. You see, if I click on this one, I can see that its brush width is 1 millimeter. Its steel density is 0.4. It has tapered ends on both sides, and the angle type is called orthogonal. And there's also another option called fixed. And you can always change these options by clicking on the little button beside them. A little downward arrow means there's a selection. So tapered ends, both sides, the start side, the end, or both, or none. And so what I'm telling you is, even though you drew your stitch using tapered end tool, you could come in and choose to turn it off. So this is the ability to interact with the properties. You can also, even though we drew this one as a width of 3, decide that you want it wider and change it to 4. And when you do, you click apply to take effect. And if you want to make it skinnier, you type in a smaller number, and again, you click apply for that to take effect. You can also click on the enter button. So if I select on this one and change it to a width of 3 and click enter on my keyboard, that will also update the results. So there are other tabs in the properties box. Generally speaking, there's tabs and transform. However, that may change based upon the type of shape that you have selected. And so when you have a steel stitch, as this is, with the brush type tapered ends, you have these basic properties. If I click on the commands tab, I can change the start command and end command and the tie-in and the tie-off. And so there are basic choices that you could make here for things like, trim or stop or frame out. And so without trying to get into too much detail today about some of the specifics and the fine-tuning ones, generally speaking, you may and may not want to learn about turning off the tie-ins, because sometimes you want to make sure that your thread will sort of tie off and therefore trim it afterwards. Sometimes you don't want that to happen, and so you can turn those on and off. And so we'll learn more about the specific things in subsequent videos. The transform tab is the way that you can mathematically decide what size something will be, rather than just clicking and dragging, which you can do. But when you use the transform tab, you can type in a specific number, and you can do that in inches or in metric, whichever makes you happy. So if you want your embroidery to be exactly 4 inches wide, you can type that in. And if you want it to be a specific dimension proportionally, you can uncheck the maintain aspect ratio and then change it to be 3 inches or 4 inches wide by 4 inches tall. And so that will stretch it out and to make it into a square shape. And so this is the idea, that you will use the tool to create the shape, And then now I'll try calligraphy. And then you can use your program preferences to interact with the way that it looks. So when I selected the calligraphy, notice that the brush type, the properties have changed slightly. And now I have the ability, for example, to change the angle of the brush. So the angle that the stitches are on, and it's on 145. And if I change it to, I don't know, 30, it'll be almost like the opposite way. And so now it's thick here and thin there. And so you can change that. And you've also got sort of, again, the angle type. And you've got tapering. So just on the start and the end, or none. So kind of like you could almost combine the two if you wanted. And again, you still have the transform and the commands tab. And so those didn't change. And so each time you draw a new type of steel stitch, so then pressure sensitive, well, pressure sensitive and steel stitch are going to be more or less the same. It's a basic steel. It doesn't have the ability to do the thick and thin like the calligraphy did. Okay. And so that's the idea, that you can come in, change the width, change the density, change the corner type, change the angle of the stitching. This is called an inset. You can actually change where the stitching applies along your line. So if I just get closer and turn off 3D, the stitching is going right down the center of the line that we drew. And if I select that and then change the inset from 50 to, let's say, 30 and click apply, it's like it moves it off a little bit. And so, I don't know, maybe you're bordering something and you want to offset the border a little bit. That's the idea. So this is the properties boxes for fine tuning. You have the ability to check on the start and end cap of your line to basically put like a chisel on the end of it, rounded, sharp point, 45 point, whatever you want, and it makes it a point. So steel stitch. So each style that we choose in our brush selector comes with different abilities to adjust. And so the next one we can talk about is applique. And so if I go ahead and draw an applique shape and then select that applique shape, so click on it to select it, notice the properties tab now says applique at the top of the tab. And these are the things that we could adjust about an applique. So what kind of cover stitch would you like? Blanket edge, a satin edge, or a motif edge? And so a blanket edge will give it more of a handmade look. And a motif edge will allow you to choose from a list of different pre-programmed motif patterns that could outline your shape. And now you have further property enhancements for things like the size of the motif. And again, there's an inset button. And so if I change the size of the motif to, let's say, be 5 instead of 4, those will get larger. And then you have options for things like what type of corner, sharp, round, and oval, or bevel, as well as sewing placement line. So do you want to include the placement line, the tack down line, and the finish? So the 3 steps of the applique could be kind of removed with a checkbox. And so those are the properties box for an applique. The next one on the list was fill, and when I choose the fill, I can click and drag to draw the fill. And now when I select the fill stitch, the properties box relates to a fill. And the first thing is, what type of fill are you going to have? It's a standard fill. If you had other software, so other levels of the Floriani software, for example, FTCU, there might be other types, but here what we have is a standard fill. But we do have other patterns. So you can choose from 4 different patterns. There's a smooth pattern, a satin pattern. Then you have pattern 1, 2, and 3, and those patterns create a different texture to the way the fill goes. And it has to do with the way the needle penetrations step down as to the actual texture that you get when it sews out. And so one might be slightly more smoother than the other one is. But that's the concept, that you can change your fill patterns. You can, of course, change the stitch length and the density, which will affect the number of stitches in your fill. So the smaller the number for the density, the closer the rows will be together for your fill. So right now it's 0.4. If I make that 0.8, 0.8, they will be further apart. And if I make that 0.3, they will be much closer together. And the closer they are together, the more stitching there is in your design. I should point out that when I select this shape, that down at the bottom it tells me that this design has a total of 6 segments, that I have one segment selected, and that one segment has 9,613 stitches. And you'll notice if you change the density to be a lower number, well, higher number, lower density, that it takes the stitch count down. Now it's got 6,396 stitches in that shape. And so this is how the properties box works. I also want to point out that when we did a filled in area, we now have the ability to control the underlay, which is the stitching that sews underneath this fill. And so there's some options between perpendicular, contour, parallel, as well as the density of your underlay, the stitch length of your underlay, and how far or how close it gets to your borders. So all the things that you can control. It's currently set on perpendicular, and you can see it when you zoom in. It's perpendicular. The fill is going at a 0, and the underlay is sewing at the 90. If I change it to be a contour and not a perpendicular, it will go around the outside and not through the middle of it. And if I have both selected, it will give both. Parallel will go the same direction as the fill as opposed to perpendicular to it. So there's different times when you make different shapes when different underlay styles will seem more appropriate. But it's the properties box, which is how you can control that. And the last 2 brush types are run stitch styles. And so when you have the bean stitch or the run stitch, so if I do the run stitch, I have, and I'll select that, and I'll turn on 3D. Now I have a tab for run, and it's set as a single run. I could also do a double run or a motif run. So if I change to a double run, it'll go kind of like a bean. It'll make it be thicker in line length, line thickness. The double run and then the motif run, this is where you get to choose from a list of different motif patterns that can sew along your line. So you can draw these different motif lines. And you can see what they'll look like in the pattern selection on the side like that. And now that I've chosen a motif, I have further options to enhance the properties of that motif. Bigger pattern size, further spacing in between them, and shorter or longer stitch lengths. And so that's kind of how it works with the run stitch. Notice that on the run, it has a tab for run extra. This is how you make it into a bean stitch. So if you were a single run line, you could convert that over to be a bean stitch by turning that on, and then you have bean repeats number is 3. Is the only option, and so it goes forward and back and forward again to create that bean stitch effect. And so if you tell it right off the bat that you're drawing a bean stitch, then that simply is already turned on. So select this, notice the run extra is already turned on. Whereas if you do draw like I did the first time, a single run line with the brush selector, the last choice is single run lines. It simply means that you're drawing it single, but then you can change it to a bean later. And so generally speaking, the bean will make the line a little more bold because instead of going over it 1 time each stitch, it does each stitch 3 times. So the more bold line. And so this is the video that we made to go over all of the different types of properties that you're able to change by selecting a shape using your select tool and interacting with your properties box.